Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is Sonship Establishment Part 3, and this is going to be session 30. We left off in the midst of a bunch of verses where we were going through Kings, and I was kind of outlining the way things had gone. We left off with Josiah. Let me take you now to the next verse that's going to talk about the death of Josiah, 2 Kings 23:30. And his servants carried him into a chariot dead from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own sepulchre. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's stead. So let's go ahead and put him up here then. Jehoahaz. And so now he's going to follow his father, Josiah. Look back now at the PowerPoint, 2 Kings 23:32. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all his fathers had done. And that's the way. And I'll just give you the rest of these verses and we'll just work through them. And then verse 33, and Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and put the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah's father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. So now we have the next one. Jehoiakim, let's see, that's Jehoiakim. Okay. So the Pharaoh of Egypt takes away Jehoahaz, then Jehoiakim comes along, and now let's read the next one, 23:37. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all his fathers had done. And now 24:1, in his days Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up. Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years, and he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants the prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. And now 24:11, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it, and he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces the vessels of gold, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, every 10,000, even 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and smiths, none remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. He carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And all the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000, all that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. Now, here's the thing that I need us to talk about now. Were there any people among those that were in Israel that did not follow those evil kings, that did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord? Well, yes, and you can even name some of those. Wasn't Daniel carried away captive? Yet Daniel was still faithful to the Lord. And there were others as well that we could name. But the point I'm trying to get to is this, that the scattering that took place when the armies of Israel failed because the Lord did not go forth with them, the only place on the timeline you can locate that is right here. And that's what that's talking about. The 70-year captivity. Now I need to take you back to I want to take you back to Psalm 44 and look with me here in verse 17. All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons, and covered us with the shadow of death, if we have forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. Yea, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. For those who remember God during this time, they didn't deal falsely in his covenant. Remember when Daniel went into captivity, he wasn't going to eat what they wanted to feed him. He wanted to remain true to the law. Their heart was not turned back. Many of them were, but not all of them. They did not decline their steps from His way, and they didn't stretch out their hands to a strange God. They said God would have known it. And then they end in verse 22 with, "Yea, we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter." Now, here, I know what I'm teaching you here is going to be a little off track from what you may have heard. But look, here's the point I'm trying to make to you. And that is, because all of that that's in Psalm 44 is referring to what's happening here at the first part, when they're carried away captive to Babylon, you have some people in that group who did not deal falsely, who did not depart from the Lord. But they are not being dealt with as sons. They do not have the sonship education. The new covenant has not yet been applied to them. And until it does, they can't function that way as sons. What they're going to do, though, in verse 22, when Psalm 44:22 says, "Yea, we are killed all the day long, we're accounted as sheep for the slaughter," they're going away captive too. Some of those people died, just like those who were rebellious. In other words, they were looking at that and saying, remember what they were used to. They were used to, if we do the right thing, God will intervene for us. Now suddenly, He's not intervening. Look, just think with me about how this psalm is laying itself out. The first 8 verses is rehearsing, God, we were told what You did when our people came into the land. How You got them a great victory. It wasn't by their own strength or by their own sword, but You were the one that did that. And now they're saying, and now You don't go forth with our armies. We're turning back from the enemy. We're being killed all the day long. We're accounted as sheep for the slaughter. You know what that is? That is their complaint. This is not an epiphany of a son realizing he's a son. This is a complaint that, wait a minute, we thought You were supposed to intervene for us. Let me ask you a question. Those of you that are following us along, if you've been tracking with us, you're in Romans chapter 8. You're not even a simple son yet. And because you're not a simple son, not because, but in view of the fact that you're not a simple son, let me ask you a question. Don't you already know that to complain and whine about the circumstances that are happening to you and expect God to physically intervene in those circumstances is a wrong way to look at that? Don't you already know that? You're telling me that fully educated sons, and the reason I say fully educated sons is because, you know what they're being dealt with out here? Remember those 7 categories of attacks? They started out with tribulation and distress and persecution, and they came on, remember, and then perils, and then finally at the end, sword. And we talked about how they were progressive, and that Satan can't use the worst of these attacks on a novice son. But these will only be escalated as a son progresses through the sonship curriculum. Well, if these folks are being killed all the day long and accounted as sheep for the slaughter, then you know what? That's sword. And that will only happen to a fully educated son. You're telling me that fully educated sons in the day of wrath don't know any better than to whine about the fact that they're undergoing these kinds of tribulations? I don't believe that for 1 minute. I don't believe that they suddenly had to wake up and come to themselves and go, oh, wait a minute, that isn't what... you know what? You're not a simple son yet. You already know better than that. You're telling me fully educated sons had to just kind of wake up and remember that? Balderdash. That's not right. Those guys, they will know better than that. They not only know that they're suffering, they know why they're suffering. And if you think that that's contained in Psalm 44:22, you're wrong. When it says, we're going to talk about what it means, for thy sake we are killed all the day long, and you'll see exactly why that's true of the Babylonian captivity. but they're not sending out armies. And just to show you that, let's just work down through Psalm 44. In those first 8 verses, that was the review of what God used to do when He intervened for them and overcame their enemies for them. And now in verse 9, and I'm not going to put the where because we're not through with it yet, you have a complaint. You have a complaint that's being lodged. It's like, well, wait, you're not doing that for us. What's wrong? And if you come down to verse 22, and you say, oh, 22 is when they wake up now and they realize, oh, the policy of evil is doing these things to us for thy sake. If that's what you think, then how come 23 starts the very same complaint that was voiced to you starting up here in verse 9? And that's the thing that I want to show you. In fact, take a look with me. Psalm 44:9. Here's where the complaint started. But thou hast cast off and put us to shame, and goest not forth with our armies. Now, look at verse 23. Awake! Why sleepest thou, O Lord? Arise! Cast us not off forever. Isn't that the exact same thing that they were saying in verse 9? If in verse 22 you think they suddenly woke up and came to themselves and said, oh, we realize it's for your sake we're going through this, if that's what you think that is, because it applies up here, which it doesn't, but if you do, how come in verse 23 they take up the complaint again? It doesn't make any sense. Remember what they... Look back at the PowerPoint. Verse 9. There's the first words of their complaint. But thou hast cast off and put us to shame. Look at verse 23. Cast us not off forever. Does it look like they've come to some epiphany of waking up? In fact, look at the first part of verse 23. Awake, why sleepest thou, O Lord? Arise. Look, when they're over here, when this is happening, they're thinking, wait a minute, God is supposed to intervene for us. The believing remnant knows better than that. But these guys are thinking God's supposed to intervene for us. By the way, if verse 22 was the wake-up call, how come in verse 23 they're accusing God of being asleep? And He needs to wake up and do something. Now that just won't fit. And so I'm just saying, Psalm 44 isn't talking about sons at all. It's not talking about the remnant suffering under the sword, under the policy of evil. It's talking about the entire nation going away into captivity where they are used to God intervening between them and their enemies. And in their program under the law, that's exactly how that happened as long as they were obedient to keep the law. But if they did not keep the law, guess what? Then they were going to get the curses for that. So, as we're looking at that, let me just kind of 1, 2, 3 this, and let me just see, I don't think I have it on the PowerPoint. I don't, so we're going to hold off on the PowerPoint for a moment, but let me just kind of 1, 2, 3 through this. Look, if you think Psalm 44 is talking about them out here in the day of wrath, then you know what? These guys are getting the sword before they're educated enough to know they shouldn't be whining and complaining about it. Now, either that's true, and Satan can just throw the sword at you anytime he gets ready, or fully educated sons in Israel's program can't discern the afflictions that are coming upon them. And I don't read anything over there that tells me about that. Or Psalm 44 is not talking about adopted sons in Israel's program, but it is referring to the faithful who kept God's law during the time the whole nation was carried away captive, and they were unsuccessful in repelling the Babylonian army. They were carried away captive and scattered among the heathen and became a byword and a proverb and a reproach and all of that business. And they were undergoing the very judgments that were predicted. I had to correct that. I see I wrote it down wrong a while ago. Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, that those things prophesied all along. Now we need to draw this to an application. Because here's what verse 22 is doing in Psalm 44. They are lamenting the position they're in. And because of that, they're saying, You know, we're being killed all the day long. We're just like sheep appointed to slaughter. That is the statement of a person who is wondering why God isn't intervening. That's a complaint about that. And what you're going to see is that the Apostle Paul, as you come down through Romans, in 35, you had those 7 categories of suffering. In 36, so there's 35. There's the attacks of the policy of evil. In verse 36, he quotes Psalm 44. Because that's how those attacks of the policy of evil are going to attempt to make you feel. But here's what he is going to say, because the remedy, folks, the remedy doesn't start in verse 36. The remedy starts in verse 37. Because verse 37 turns a corner from verse 34, in which he says, "Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors." If verse 36 is quoting Psalm 44:22, "We are killed all the day long, we're accounted as sheep for the slaughter," that is that comment of complaint and resignation. You've just thrown us out there and you're just letting everything happen to us. But the Apostle Paul is taking what they thought, not sons, but what they thought up here, where God was intervening for them, and they were wondering why He wasn't. He's taken that kind of a thought and bringing it down here to show you, if that's what you get to thinking, you're thinking about this entirely wrong. Because the next word out of his mouth is, "Nay." Now, it's more than no, and we'll talk about what nay means. But he's saying, we're killed, as it is written, we are killed all the day long. We're accounted sheep for the slaughter. No! In all these things we are more than conquerors. We're not sheep for a slaughter. We're more than conquerors. And that's a different mindset. You have a mindset that says, well, I'm just being killed all the day long. But you got another mindset that says, because we're sons. And that's the point. Paul is making a distinction between what they felt here and what you felt here in the dispensation of grace as you're dealt with as a son. That they may have felt that way, but you're supposed to say, in all these things we are more than conquerors. That's a whole different way of thinking. Do you see that? And so to understand what Psalm 44 is, Psalm 44, and especially verse 22, we're killed all the day long, we're appointed as sheep for the slaughter, is not about coming to any kind of realization about, oh, we're sons, oh yeah, we're not supposed to complain, because the entire rest of the psalm is a complaint. The very next words in verse 23 say, hey God, you're sleeping, you need to wake up and do something. Don't cast us off forever. And if you read through the rest of that psalm, all the way to the last verse, it's a complaint. Why aren't you doing something? So don't talk to me about that's going to be some kind of a wake-up call for them. It's not a wake-up call. So why am I making such a big deal out of this? Because that's not part of the remedy. Verse 37 is the remedy. Now, just so you don't take this too lightly, let me just remind you of what was happening to them by taking you now to Deuteronomy 28. So let's look there now on the PowerPoint. Deuteronomy 28:21. The Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee until he have consumed thee from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou be destroyed. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed unto all the kingdoms of the earth. And thy carcass shall be meat unto all the fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, and with the scab, and with the itch, whereof thou canst not be healed. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt. I have that twice. Verse 28. The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. And thou shalt grope at noonday as the blind gropeth in darkness. and thou shalt not prosper in thy ways, and thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build a house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. Thine ass shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored unto thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. And before we change the PowerPoint, you notice all that is because the enemy is coming in, and they're going to do all of that. You're going to build a house, the enemy's going to have it. You plant a vineyard, and the enemy's going to gather the grapes of it. Verse 32, thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long. And there shall be no might in thine hand. The fruit of thy land and all thy labor shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up. And thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed alway, so that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. Doesn't that kind of remind you of, we're killed all the day long, we're counted as sheep for the slaughter? You'll be only oppressed and crushed alway. And that alway has no S on it. That means all the way, not in all ways. Verse 35, the Lord shall smite thee in the knees and in the legs with a sore botch that cannot be healed. From the sole of thy foot unto the top of thy head, the Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt serve, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations where the Lord shall lead thee. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. All thy trees and the fruit of thy land shall the locust consume. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. And doesn't that happen no matter if you're a person who has followed the Lord or not? When this happens, this is happening to the entire nation. And now one more passage, Deuteronomy 28:49. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. And we saw that back in Leviticus 26. So that the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children which he shall leave, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there shalt thou serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and a failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even, and at even thou say, Would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again, and there shall you be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Well, it doesn't matter how faithful you are as an individual. The loss of property, the loss of family, the hunger that came from the long sieges. You don't really think that when that was all undergoing in that first part of the fifth course of punishment, that the people who stayed faithful to the Lord had plenty to eat in their home. They were starving just like anyone else. No wonder they declare Psalm 44:22. Let's look at it again on the PowerPoint. Yea, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We're accounted as sheep for the slaughter. And that word yea is a word that brings emphasis upon what is being said. In a way, in the same way that when Jesus would say, truly, I say unto you, to emphasize what he was about to say, that's what the word yea is for here. It is to bring emphasis upon that. That's what these people are emphasizing. They're used to God intervening for them, and now he is not. So what about that word sake? Well, when you do something for someone's sake, what does that mean? Well, the word can have three different meanings depending on, how you're using it. And let me take you to the PowerPoint and I'll just show them to you. The first one is about purpose or motive. The second one is about advantage or good for the sake of his health. The third one is for personal benefit or interest, for someone else's sake. Now, let me just say that Charles Smith, and if you've listened, you know that he has written that book, and I don't have it on the PowerPoint for you, but Charles Smith says this: if I do something for his sake, I mean that I am doing it because I have an end in view which I believe is to his interest if I accomplish it. Now you read Psalm 44, verse 22, we're killed all the day long, we're counted sheep for the slaughter. In fact, you can read the whole psalm, and you'll realize that the people who are being afflicted are not doing something for God's sake. Something is happening to them for God's sake. These are the events that are leading up to the Babylonian captivity. Is that captivity, is that siege, is that tribulation they're going through, being killed all the day long, is that serving an interest that God means to have happen in his plan and purpose with Israel? And the answer is yes. It is for his sake that that's taking place, because all the way back in the first books of the Old Testament, that was spoken of. And God gave them that as a warning and told them what was going to happen. And so, here's the point that I'm trying to get to end up this session. What Paul is trying to do is to take the wrong thinking of the people that were here. And what else would they think, after all? They weren't being treated as sons, so they didn't have sonship thinking to look at. But what he's doing is he's taking that kind of thinking and he's inserting it in right after he lists those 7 categories of attacks of the policy of evil. And then he's going to follow that with the next verse to say, nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors. This idea that you're just going to be, because even though you know better, don't you still have that little question in the back of your mind that says, well, I know I'm not supposed to ask God to stop this thing that's happening to me, or ask him to intervene in the physical circumstances of my life, or I know I'm not supposed to do that, but is he just throwing us out there, throwing us to the wolves, so to speak? Is he just leaving us out there? You still have that question. And that's why verse 37 becomes the remedy that it does. Because he's going to say, I know what your question is. I know what your thinking is. You're going to be thinking, hey, just like these guys thought, we're just thrown out there like sheep for the slaughter. And he's going to say no. He's actually going to say more than no, because what's resident in the word nay, the Bible's used the word no plenty of times. But it's going to use the word nay here, which isn't used nearly as often as no, because it is emphasizing something particular. Now, I'm not going to talk about it in this lesson. When we come back in the next session, I'll talk to you about what that word nay is about. But that's the turning point. That is the thing where he says, all of this thing that went before, no. Because in all of these things, we're not sheep for the slaughter. We're more than conquerors. We're not just being thrown to the wolves. There is something that's being done here that is way above that kind of thinking. That's the thing that I wanted to bring your attention to. Now, I know we took a long time to go through these. I know what we did is we looked at all of this, and I know we detailed a lot of things that maybe we didn't have to do, but I'm trying to make the point that when you see Psalm 44:22, that is not an epiphany that the believing remnant is coming to out here. As educated sons, they know exactly what they're in for. It's told to them in plain print. They're going to have to figure it out. I mean, Keith Blades used to say that the Revelation was like a daily newspaper for things that they could expect to come along. And if that's the case, then they know about that, and they're aware of that, and they know why it's happening like that. I believe that because they're undergoing the sword, they are fully educated sons. And because of that, they do know better. But what you're supposed to do is, you're supposed to, as you learn about this, and where are you? Where is Paul telling you this? He's telling you this in your sonship establishment. He's not telling you this when you're over there in Ephesians. He's telling you this now before you ever begin your education. Because he realizes that even though you know I'm not expecting God to intervene for me like they were, I still just look at that and think we're just kind of being thrown out there to fend for ourselves. And he is now going to give you a wonderful remedy that is going to produce the confidence in your Heavenly Father that you've got to have before you start your education, and the confidence in His curriculum that there's absolutely nothing that's been overlooked, that it will handle everything that will come your way, so that you will be able to say, like the Apostle Paul, "For I am persuaded." And the thing that will persuade you of that is to change your thinking from, I've just been kind of left out there on my own to fend for myself, to, no, these are the things that are going to make us more than conquerors. And when we come back in the next session, we'll talk about what that phrase means. What does it mean to be more than a conqueror? And we'll talk about why the use of that word nay instead of the word no.